Introducing our next speaker. She is a Christian woman of African descent, native of New Jersey, a resident of Waco, Texas. Dr. Sherece Shavel is an assistant professor of practice in the School of Social Work at UT Arlington, a contributing faculty member in the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences at Walden University, as well as co-founder and inaugural president of the Central Texas Association of Black Social Workers. She is the creator and host of a new social work inspired podcast, Sundays with Dr. Shavel, focused on uncovering issues of lived experience and journeys to greatness relevant to social work practice. Dr. Shavel holds a bachelor's in social work from Seton Hall University, a master's in social work administration, policy and planning from Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, and a PhD in human services with a criminal justice specialization from Walden University. Her credentials include a certification in forensic social work, licensure as a master of social work in 3 different states, including Texas, and Human Services Board Certified Practitioner, which is a national designation. Dr. Shavel's career exceeds 20 years of professional social work in areas of counseling, case management, teaching, program development, and administrative leadership. As a social worker, her professional initiative is in part is to sensitize the social consciousness of others to the parenting challenges being confronted by formerly incarcerated fathers, in addition to advancing their social position within the family unit and the broader community. Before transitioning to higher education to prepare individuals for advanced social work practice, Dr. Shavel had professional positions in both private and public correctional settings in several states. While working in the correctional setting, she designed and implemented 3 counseling program initiatives, as well as an educational life skills program, U-Turn, Straight Talk for Offenders Negotiating Change, designed for the transitional correctional setting to address psychosocial spiritual concerns for optimal outcomes around re-entry and reintegration. Dr. Shavel currently serves as a peer reviewer for the Journal of Social, Behavioral, and Health Sciences, as well as for the NASW Texas Annual Conference. Her present academic focus involves advancing forensic social work education and certification. Her current research focus involves exploring the multifaceted lived experience of parenting among formerly incarcerated African American fathers to inspire strength-driven, solution-aspired intervention. So welcome, 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 Dr. Sherece Shavel.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Elizabeth, thank you for the introduction. And I also want to especially thank Marlon Jones for inviting me to present as a keynote at today's conference. Thank you also to Starry for organizing this event, and for all others here for participating and giving attention to the thoughts of each speaker, including myself. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. I seem to be having some technical difficulties, so if something goes out while I'm talking, I'll do my best to try to get back connected. So the idea of engaging incarcerated fathers is a complicated matter to unpack. And there are numerous factors associated, such as parentage, parental rights, child support, child study, child custody, child safety, corrections protocols, issues of health and wellness, with regard to the father, interests of the mother, and there are other influences as well. But with the time allotted I have today, I can only touch the very surface of these matters. So after responding to the request to share with you today about engaging incarcerated fathers, I thought to myself, what should I share? What shall I share about a matter that is so important as this? And having an orientation as a qualitative researcher, within seconds, I was flooded by thoughts of my own experiences around engaging incarcerated fathers. And one of the earliest experiences recalled may be considered pivotal in my work in this area. A certain middle-aged man recently transported to the facility was escorted to my office for his classification interview. And I recall being swamped that day with all kinds of to-do, but I kindly welcomed him. And as he took a seat, he quietly stated, "I wonder what Matt is doing." He got no response from me, none. I proceeded on to do what was needed within a minute or two. He said, "I tried to call my son before I got picked up and didn't answer his phone, and I hadn't talked to my son." And he would interject comments about his son a few times as we were meeting. And each time he would put his head down after speaking. He would lift his head to answer questions, but would return to staring at the floor after commenting about his son. I really wasn't paying attention, focusing on my to-do. I didn't pick up on or meaningfully respond to his subtle cues of disappointment as well as wanting. So after finishing my work, I escorted him back to his unit. And at the point of standing at the door of the unit, he turned to me and said, "You know why every time I mentioned my son, I would look down? I would put my head down and stare at the floor." Still not paying attention. I didn't really do too much thinking about it, but I was focused on thinking about my next to do, honestly. So I just casually responded, "No, no." And he proceeded to say, "It hurts. It hurts not being able to talk to my son. It hurts not being able to see my son." I recall that at that moment, I was either missing something or I was dismissing something. And I concluded that I was doing both. I was missing the element of care and dismissing the role of father. And I was missing an expression of commitment that came from him and dismissing the presence of possibility. Before this encounter, before this encounter actually triggered my awakening to this concern of fathers within the correctional setting, I was so out of tune that I can't even recall or even determine how many opportunities I actually missed to perform father-focused engagement. But this experience led me to another question. And that question was, what are you going to do about it? And I now think of Joe Madison, and I say this in my Joe Madison voice, "What are you going to do about it?" So, you know anything about Joe Madison, just imagine him saying that, that statement. So it goes without saying, fathers who are incarcerated exist under unique circumstances that bring forward unique experiences that can't be supported by business as usual. And the business as usual approach does not result in change because it obstructs the capacity to discover assets of strength. Discovery plus utilization of strengths, in part, is what makes or what it means to perform strengths-based practice. So in thinking about what I should share on the idea of engaging incarcerated fathers, my view is not on how I can influence the involvement of fathers in the lives of their children, but rather how I can create and nurture an environment that elicits the motivation of fathers to involve themselves in the lives of their children. So considering a basic definition of the term engage, which is to pledge to do something, as taken from Merriam-Webster, I abandoned the inclination to do business as usual or to continue doing business as usual and began reestablishing myself as a strengths-based practitioner. I moved with the intention to shift my perspective, which in turn shifted how I related to the residents within the facility. I became conscientious and intentional, leading me to observe, critique, and move to correct my own situatedness. As quick as one can blink an eye, I realized I created a huge problem. I was working against the status quo, control and punishment. So I retreated to become strengths-based light, L-I-T-E, light, to avoid going to battle with the correctional culture. Before going further, I want to clarify the strengths perspective with a few thoughts. According to Dennis Levy, as I cited from his chapter "Power in the People" in the sixth edition of the Strengths Perspective in Social Work, this approach honors the innate wisdom of the human spirit, the inherent capacity for transformation of even the most humbled and abused. Given this point, to engage incarcerated fathers from a strengths perspective, the professional believes that they, by virtue of being human, possess wisdom. And by virtue of being being human, they possess wisdom that is worthy of both recognition and respect. We can agree that as an incarcerated person, fathers endure humbled and abused realities. Yet these realities do not deter fathers who possess a deep-seated desire to have an intimate parental connection with their children. This motivation is an asset that a strengths-focused practitioner should not only discover, but nurture, amplify, and use. So to engage incarcerated fathers from a strengths perspective, the professional also believes that they, by virtue of being human, have the capacity for change. So the challenge for me was not that I did not believe, but that I was in an environment where this belief was largely absent. Quoting Salibi, the strengths perspective is a simple formula. It's a simple formula to rally clients' interests, capacities, motivations, resources, and emotions in the work of reaching their hopes and dreams. It helped them find pathways to those goals, and the payoff may be an enhanced quality of daily life for them. So in order to rally interests, capacities, motivations, resources, and emotions to reach hopes and dreams and find pathways to achieving these goals, resulting in an enhanced quality of daily life, the professional in a correctional setting will need to be present. And when I say present, I mean by paying attention. In fact, deliberately going after realizing these things in every aspect of their work. As I shared, there was no deliberate response or effort on my part in this early experience. It was not uncommon for practitioners in this certain correctional setting to find themselves managing high workloads and conflicted by checking off boxes of to do, rather than going after meaningful impact in the lives of residents. The father in my story was gentle in expressing his objection to my lack of response to his expressions about his son. There were others who would just plainly say to me, "I know you don't care, you're just doing your job." So in order to engage incarcerated fathers meaningfully, they must first perceive that you authentically care about what they care about. And they care about their relationship with their children. Their radar is sensitive to scoping out those who are of the mindset, you lost your right to be a father when you came here. And this is a resounding attitude within correctional settings from my experience. And that seemed to feed ideas of punishment rather than transformation. And to adopt the strengths perspective is to recognize opportunities of possibility, if not create them, in order to evoke lifelong enriched father-child relationships, even while the father is in the correctional setting. There is one final point by Salibi I want to bring forward, and it is in the same chapter. He advised that when practitioners adopt the strengths perspective, they can expect stimulating challenges in the character of their work and in the quality of their relationships with those whom they serve. So my efforts to reestablish myself within this correctional setting was undoubtedly a stimulating change to the character and quality of my work that seemed to resonate throughout the facility. The culture of the setting prompted an adverse reaction to my efforts rather than supporting. And what I have come to learn from this early experience is that sometimes being a strengths-based practitioner within a correctional setting means you are willing to go against the grain of the status quo, despite consequences, in order to improve the relational outcomes of incarcerated fathers with whom you are working. In a correctional setting, to be strengths focused is to be social justice and human rights focused. And for me, in this certain correctional setting, going to work was like entering the ring. Coming through the entrance gate, I can hear the boxing announcer in my ear, "Are you ready to rumble?" And for some strengths focused practitioners in the correctional setting, this really is the reality. And so to meaningfully engage in incarcerated fathers, you have to say, "Yes, I'm ready to rumble," and keep it moving. So as noted at the start of my talk, there are a number of factors involved in engaging incarcerated fathers. And one of them is identification. The data available about fathers in correctional settings is flawed or for various reasons, and partly because tracking fathers in various correctional settings is largely not being practiced. Therefore, to engage incarcerated fathers to improve the relational outcomes with their children, you have to be intentional with identifying them and asking their wants and needs. The challenges seem endless at best. I can recall story after story by incarcerated fathers experiencing barriers to connecting with their children. An incarcerated man who learns he is a father to a 7-year-old girl after being socially isolated for 6 years, believing to have no children. And then next minute, he's a father. A father who calls his maternal counterpart to talk with his son, and while on the phone, his son refers to his mother's new boyfriend as his daddy. So you can imagine the impact there. But there are also wins, and there are a lot of wins in comparison. A father who has become empowered because he is consistently being validated by his maternal counterpart, or that father who has found a way to express his love for the first time without any coaching. Those are some significant wins. Considering my experience engaging fathers in correctional settings, it was important for me to help others recognize the link of being a father and having health outcomes. When I say the link between being a father and health outcomes, I'm talking about all of the health outcomes: behavioral, mental, emotional, physical, spiritual, all of them. And it's important to make that connection. I must say that my experience working with fathers in a correctional setting was grounded by me being deliberate in reframing bad situations to draw out hopes and dreams and possibilities and opportunities and other things. So this was about midday, and I was on the unit of my area, and I was checking in with the residents, seeing how everyone is doing. And one of the residents in this area had a routine of calling to his kids' school to learn how they were doing and to maintain his relationship with the school as an involved father. Everyone was aware that this call becomes the highlight of this father's day. And when he returns, he usually is smiling and has this high energized pep in his step. And, he is just all kinds of happy. And I happened to be on the unit for this return this day. As I watched him enter, it was quite noticeable that there was no smile and definitely no pep. And rather, his gait was a bit staggered and he appeared somewhat dazed. As he came closer, I noticed tears in his eyes. And when he drew even closer, attempting to enter his cell, I intercepted and asked, is everything okay? And this same father recently received word that his mother's health was deteriorating. So in my mind, I'm beginning to consider the possibility before hearing his response. He responded with tears increasingly falling down his face. And he said to me, I called the school and they told me my parental rights was terminated. So they wouldn't let me get any information. And at the moment of that statement being finished coming out of his mouth, it was as if the weight of those words were so heavy that he lost all sensation in his lower body, and he fell and laid prostrate on the floor and just began to wail, which seemed uncontrollably just wail on the floor. His pain was felt by everyone in the room, everyone in the unit. Those living in the unit with him gathered around and just began their efforts to console him. Several got down on the floor with him, embracing him like a brother or a father would. Several cried with him, and others began speaking words of encouragement. Others began praying out loud, and still others just remained silent. It seemed that they had kind of a taken turns kind of thing going on by placing, their hands on his back to offer some degree of comfort. And the officers on the unit responded also with great support. And so this matter of just an outpouring of support seemed to last for several hours, to support this father. And the power of peer support was certainly on display that day. And the word got out. It was like a rumor mill on steroids in that facility. It was said, something's happening over there in Shavel's area, and indeed they were right. There was something happening over there in my area. And the power of this event gave my officers a new perspective. Before the day was over, I had the assistant warden, chief of security, assistant chief, several captains and others came to express support and to encourage this father. And it was not a normal day. It was not a normal day at all. It was like a miracle of an opportunity that I seized without delay. So it was this event that ignited my passion for justice involved fathers. It was this event where I decided the time for retreating was over. It was not a second too soon. I put my boxing gloves on, and figuratively speaking, and set out to ensure that all of my units around that facility operated from a strengths perspective. And feeling empowered, I started to make my way to the warden's office to give a 10-minute pitch. And we crossed paths in the hallway, and little did I know, he was, he surprised me because he was actually on his way to my office to talk to me. And we decided to meet in his office, and he seemed really eager to hear, what I had to say, hear my vision for this needed shift as I pitched to him. And to make a long story short, my vision for the meaningful change in that particular area became a reality that day. So in my work within correctional settings, it was front and center in witnessing the resilience, the passion, the wisdom, the intelligence, and unending creative resourcefulness of fathers unhindered by their incarcerated reality, all for the sake of having intimate connection with their children. Engaging incarcerated fathers required impact-driven workers who will stay the course in nurturing fathers. So the development of positive relationships in correctional settings creates a kind of domino effect, kind of wave that goes far, it goes wide, and it has an long enduring effect. But again, this commitment to strength perspective work does not come without challenge within the correctional setting. And the last experience I would just like to share is an illustration of two incarcerated fathers, its passion and their, creative genius, which so many fathers, if not all of them, just were so very creative and so passionate about doing what they could do to connect with their children. So one father, with his young daughter in mind, spent days constructing a well-designed, fashionable purse using empty potato chip bags and cereal boxes he purchased from the facility commissary. And rather than discard the bags and boxes after eating the contents, these items became a stylish accessory, and it was a good stylish accessory, by the way. Another father, with his young son in mind, spent weeks constructing a well-built and quite durable tabletop sailboat using wood popsicle sticks, coffee, soap, and toilet paper. And this father canvassed his unit, asking others not to throw away their wooden sticks, but rather to turn them over to him so his masterpiece could be completed. Now, both fathers built their crafts in secret, unbeknownst to correctional staff, until a unit shakedown occurred. And the items were deemed contraband, of course, and were carelessly, unapologetically thrown into the trash, while each father watched every moment of the action and reported a sense of heartbreak when their crafty item that they spent time and, attentively poured into for weeks was shamelessly treated as trash. So the purse, in retrospect, the purse and sailboat weren't just items created out of rebellion for authority. These items were expressions of deep-seated longing for relationship, for connection with their children. And each father would kind of tell stories about their times of crafting these things and other things. And they would have a picture of their child in front of them, and they would stare at the picture and then continue their work, and stare at the picture and continue their work, take the picture, put it to their heart, and do all these different things, in essentially an internal cry for what these fathers stated as, my only reason for living, why I keep going. And for them, it was because, I want my son or I want my daughter to be proud of me one day. So they had this deep-seated desire not only to have relationship, but also to have a meaningful relationship that resulted in a legacy, a positive legacy. What is left to be said then is that both have no relationship. And I didn't mention that in telling the story, that these two men didn't have a relationship with their children. They had pictures, but there were circumstances that that were beyond their control that prevented them from having a relationship, but they desired it, and they desired it very deeply. But they had to come, for them, it was a need to come to this belief that it was impossible to have a relationship with their children. But as the practitioner in that setting, it was necessary for me to change that thinking, that idea, that narrative, and say, no, it is possible. It is our duty as practitioners to say and act like it, and to recognize that this is a strength, and that incarcerated fathers are capable of loving and being good fathers. And I just gave a good illustration of the expression of love that can come forth from a father. So changing the narrative, seeing the possibilities, and going after those possibilities to try to amplify those opportunities into reality. So these experiences were, and I'm not sure if I mentioned this, but they were based on work in correctional settings outside of the state of Texas. And so when I moved here, I was all kinds of happy and pleased to learn that the state has expressed a deliberate stand for incarcerated fathers. And I know that on several state websites, including the Attorney General's website, there's the statement that kind of says the role of parents in a child's life, regardless of whether they are incarcerated or not. Generally incarcerated parents are afforded the same rights and duties as parents who are not incarcerated. And when I think about that, I think about that there is an acknowledgement, and there seems to be a deliberate effort, but there are also some challenges still. And of course, tracking fathers is a challenge. But also, when it comes to incarcerated fathers, getting access to resources through the available programs, for instance, in order to be eligible for the patch program, which is papas and their children, there are a number of restrictions. And for instance, if you have been charged with a drug trafficking offense, then you are no longer able to participate in that program, or you're not eligible to participate in that program. And there are other restrictions, such as good behavior and some other things that that were listed, but there are a number of restrictions that I imagine significantly reduces the capacity for eligible participants. And so support around that, increasing the access to resources and the support for incarcerated fathers, as well as support around non-custodial parents, also needs attention. A few final points I would like to make about engaging incarcerated fathers. And I recognize that father-focused programming is in facilities within the Texas correctional settings by entity are done by entities within a community, programs and agencies and such. And so because of that, I wanted to just kind of offer a few points for consideration. And so the first point that I want to offer is that I think it's necessary for entities to assess their organization as well as their practitioners to determine whether or not they are father-centered. It's great that the community is going into the correctional setting to make efforts to change, but I'm really concerned about the attitude and the perspective that a facilitator who may be facilitating a structured program, which structured programs are great, but the attitude and perspective of the facilitator, it needs attention. And if a facilitator of the program does not have the right perspective or the right attitude, then it significantly impacts the effect of the program. So here, a question to consider is the perspective and attitude of a facilitator oriented to, or I should say is it oriented to elicitation, or is it oriented to installation? And that's a difference. So in other words, are you trying to bring out or draw out strength and motivation of incarcerated fathers, or are you trying to put it into incarcerated fathers? Because that's a different perspective. And from a strengths perspective, it's already there. And so it's finding ways to draw it out. And so I appreciate the work of all the different programs that I have come to learn about. And I know Marlon mentioned one, the Father Effects programs, but there are other programs, the Texas Initiative, Inmate Families Association, rather, Storybook book project, the Tree, and the volunteer liaisons, and et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's important to make sure that the perspective of those who are going into the settings are not carrying in with them bias and perpetuating the punishment, control, compliance, correction kind of attitude, because it would be counterproductive. Remember that just as mothers need to adjust to motherhood, a father also needs to adjust to fatherhood. So it would be important to assist, fathers, with adjusting to fatherhood, those who are incarcerated. And assisting should not mean to project your own biases and perceived notions of fathering onto individuals, but rather, as a strengths-focused practitioner, seek to understand the father's own values and beliefs that may be cultural in nature in a lot of ways, and then go along that father to utilize and enhance what's there. Too often, the problem or nature of the crime seems to be stuck at the forefront of any service rendering in incarcerated settings, or I should say in correctional settings. So I encourage practitioners who are going into the correctional setting to provide services to practice and advocate for relating with fathers, putting forward and illuminating their father identity, and let that lead your effort. As an advocate in the correctional setting, be mindful of language that counters or hinders strengths. And for instance, rather than he is an absent father, which I've heard I don't know how many times, you reframe that to he is a father without relationship, because that's really what it's all about. A father who has been socially isolated to a significant degree, who is desiring relationship to, their child. So this latter connotation illuminates and advances avenues of possibility for relational change while incarcerated, rather than the previous connotation, which actually hinders it or obstructs it. Advocate for and create mechanisms to facilitate forgiveness and reconciliation with those who have influence in the degree of connection the father has with his child or children in the community. I find that forgiveness and reconciliation is a neutralizing agent for change. And so to improve relational outcomes for incarcerated fathers, this is certainly necessary. With the changes made while working in correctional settings, I was able to influence a shift in officers' thinking, as I kind of mentioned, and to the extent, though, that a number of them who were fathers themselves began to see themselves as mentors and started to cultivate healthy mentoring relationships with residents that were served in addition to their correctional duties. And they seem to have found for them purpose for coming to work every day or showing up at work every day. So it was a great game changer. And so lastly, I encourage continued innovation in this area. I'm coming to learn of so many creative efforts happening across the country and assisting incarcerated fathers, and particularly in restoring relationships. And some corrections professionals recognize the need to move outside the walls of the correctional institution into the community to be as like a liaison. And all efforts, in my opinion, builds, that builds bridges for incarcerated fathers is good. And if we're talking about an all hands on deck approach, I think that's great. So continue to think, outside the box in terms of how incarcerated fathers can be assisted. Now, I didn't spend my time talking about theory and different structured programs because I wanted to illuminate some of the challenges that are happening within that's not problematic focus, but more of lived real experience, fathers who are in incarcerated situations and who desire very deeply to connect with their children. And I think it's important for us to be impact workers, to move to make sure that we do what we can to do what is necessary to make sure that they have those connections, that we build those bridges, and we make sure that they are able to not only have the kind of relationship that they desire, but also helping them to understand that the ability or the capacity to be great fathers, whether in a incarcerated situation or not, is there. And they have to believe it as we have to relate to them in a way that we believe it as well, and then pull it out of them in many ways in all our different programming, whether it's visitation, whether it is, coming up with mechanisms so that their arts and crafts efforts don't become contraband, but we find some mechanism to make sure that they get to its intended person, intended subject, which is their child, in order for them to be able to demonstrate that care and that passion and that love and that concern for them. And of course, other concerns such as child support and paternity and all those other things that I didn't talk about. But I hope that you are able to see an incarcerated father from a different perspective, that although they have, a criminal justice or justice involved identity, that does not mean they can't be a father, and they can be a father and be great at being a father. So we want to make sure that we open up the pathway for them to do that, nurture that and amplify it, and then use their strengths in doing that. So that is all. Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate your time and your attention.